today is the distinguished Australian composer and artist Peter Sculthorpe. He is known all over the world for his music, and I think he represents Australian music to a large extent in the eyes of musicians in the United States and Europe. Peter, welcome.
Yes, well,
we are delighted to have you here, of course. It's a privilege to have you come to our concert when we premiered your piece in Washington and also here at USC.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here, of course. Yeah.
So,
and to see you again.
Thank you.
Yes, and Elsa.
Vice versa.
And meet Silvia.
Yes, and I guess I always like to start out speaking about the music you wrote for us.
Yes.
Music the composers wrote for us, and perhaps you could tell us something about the inspiration you had for our piece.
Well, as you know, I like to write for very homogeneous groups. Like I love to write for string quartet or a string orchestra or, say, a brass group. And writing for a mixed ensemble isn't quite my thing. But I also like to write for people. I always write for people that I know, special human beings. And I think that's where, I had a little difficulty writing for your group because I was writing for you and Elsa in particular. Yes. That's what helped me to write the piece, really. Because I wouldn't write a piece for somebody I don't know, actually.
I remember you telling us that when we first spoke.
Right.
We came to your house. And,
that's right.
And met you, and then you'd heard some of our music, our CDs. I still remember you giving us a ride in your little sports car.
Oh, right, yes. I've still got that little red sports car, yes.
Well, let's, can we go to the idea, of writing for a mixed group, and particularly our ensemble? Now you've written, you're on your 14th string quartet.
String quartet. No, 15.
15. Oh,
I'm now up to Shostakovich.
Wow.
Two more to go, and I'm up to Beethoven.
And so I can see, of course, that being a string player, there's something easy about playing with other string players because the sounds meld.
Yes, that's right.
And with the clarinet and the piano, we've had to work at it very hard to make it happen.
Yes, yes.
So,
but I don't think you need to work too hard because I think it's all there, and where there is a contrast in timbre, it was planned by me. I'm perfectly happy.
Yes.
Like there's one part where you're fairly high and Elsa
is
low, and there's no way that you can really blend. But I like the contrast.
Yeah. Really. So, and I always like to point out too that one of the things is that our trio can play louder than a string quartet.
That really came across at the concert in Washington.
Really?
I was thrilled,
Yes.
because I actually like my music to be amplified, chamber music in the concert hall there, because I feel that people listen to music at home on CDs. They turn up the volume.
Yeah, it's quite a bit different, isn't it?
It surrounds them. Then they go to a concert, and the music is sort of way over there somewhere in the distance.
Yes.
And I think that if concerts are amplified, it's going to help take the chamber music concert into the future, really. But in Washington, it was a small music room, comparatively small, with resonant acoustics. And I must say, the amount of volume you got, particularly with Elsa, and the last part of the work, it was thrilling, actually.
Yes. Well, that's the potential with the clarinet and piano, of course.
That's right, yes.
Which can be so exciting. But I wanted to ask you about the musical inspiration, also about the Dreamtracks. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, your piece, Dreamtracks, is very much... it very much fits into the kind of music that I was writing. Well, it's quintessentially a 1990s piece of music of mine, because that it's in many ways sums up what I was on about. And I'd like to tell you how I arrived at this. In the first place, excuse me, I was very impressed when I read Bruce Chatwin's book, Songlines. And you know about songlines. It's really the totemic ancestor, according to Indigenous Australians, the totemic ancestor of every being climbed out of the primordial mud hole and then sang itself into being, making invisible pathways, invisible tracks, dream tracks, songlines, call them what you will, or ways of the ancestors across the land. And I was very excited about the idea of life coming through song, in fact. And that I decided that in any case, with much of my work, I tend to have used a limited amount of melodic material in my whole oeuvre. And so with my music of the 90s, I've tended to use a limited amount of material that weaves and interweaves its way through all the music. Now, how did I arrive at this material? Well, we have a national park up at the top end of Australia, Kakadu, and there's a giant rock there called Nourlangie Rock. And one day I was dropped onto it from a helicopter, and I was standing there, and somehow the wind seemed to blow into me the music of the local Aborigines, Gakaju tribe, music from early white settlement. I mean, this is in my imagination. Yes. Music from Torres Strait at the north of Australia, from New Guinea, even Indonesia. And somehow all these threads of music seemed to fuse in my mind, and they came to be my dream tracks, really. And so therefore one of them, which is first stated by the piano in your piece Dreamtracks, is in fact an Aboriginal melody meaning, or called Whistling Duck on a Billabong. Its real name is Jilili. And in the drawing that I did for you, for Dreamtracks, the melody is actually in there in the drawing.
Can you point to it?
Yes, well, and also because of the different colours and the shape of it, that was meant to be like an Aboriginal rainbow serpent.
I see.
And so the melody, Jilili, is sort of following the line of a rainbow serpent.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And all these tracks are like dream tracks or song lines across the land.
Yes. That's fantastic. So, and I only learned this year from you when I had the idea that it would be great to have a piece of art for this flyer, that you were an artist, actually.
Well, I wouldn't call myself an artist, but I enjoy drawing.
It's beautiful.
I mean, I keep wishing that my music would dry up, and then I could spend the rest of my life drawing and writing books. But it doesn't look as though it's going to dry up.
I hope not.
Right.
Beautiful.
So therefore, your piece then pulls upon all those threads that I first imagined I heard in 1989 when I was on top of that rock. And I've been on a journey using some of these lines over the past 10 years or so, and I'm now taking some with me and moving off to another place. I don't know where, though.
Another direction.
Another direction, yes.
Backtracking a little bit.
Can I tell you a funny story?
Yes, of course.
We did, in the early 90s, we did a concert of my works in the Kakadu National Park. And there were some thousands of people, a waiting list of some thousands of people wanting to get in. And they couldn't be allowed in because numbers are limited, mostly for environmental reasons. Yeah. It was a wonderful concert because my guitar concerto, written for John Williams, is called Nourlangie, after the rock that I'd been dropped on.
Oh, yes.
And hearing Nourlangie played under the rock by John Williams was just wonderful. Okay. Well, A few weeks after the concert, I was in London being interviewed by the BBC, and I was explaining that numbers are limited because the park is fairly small. Yeah. And the person interviewing me said, "Oh, just how small is this park?" And I said, "Oh, well, it's only about the size of Scotland." She nearly collapsed. But in a way that puts it into perspective, yes, what an Australian composer is dealing with, because I think an American composer is also dealing with this same broad landscape.
Yes. And I remember when we first started to work on Dreamtracks, yes, you made a comment because we sent you a tape and you felt that we were trying to have too many ups and downs, or to do too yes, much with yes, the music.
That's right.
And
yes.
And I think your comment related to the vast spaces of Australia. Yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, you probably need only to look at a score of, say, Schoenberg or Webern, if you think of their music as quintessentially European. Yes. And you'll find, often every note has a different marking, yes, upon it, and the yes, scores are full of dynamic changes and articulate, full of directions. Yes. And I've decided in recent years to make it, I might have one dynamic that lasts for pages.
Yes.
And I'm not into the detail anymore, and I think that's because of the Australian landscape that just goes on and on, yes, and yes, in one dynamic. Yes. And every now and again, suddenly a big rock might produce, or a flight of birds, but yes, basically it's just, it's not about detail. your very opening melody on
Yes.
at the very beginning,
Yeah.
that is the melody that finally Elsa expands and it becomes ecstatic
Yes.
with later in the work.
Yes.
So,
Yes. More
so
growing. Keeps
it's
on
not,
growing.
yes, so I don't, it's not development, it's more like variation.
Yes.
That's what my music
Yes.
does. It uses variation technique.
Variation technique.
Yes.
Yes, in approaching form, I remember you were telling me once that you were more influenced by the French composers than by the German composers. Do you
Yes.
still feel that, or?
But I'm not. It's the development sections in, say, German music are the sections that really even embarrass me sometimes. I just
Really?
don't. Development is not something that I like in music. And for me, the greatest composers, I mean, Bach didn't develop.
Yeah.
Monteverdi didn't develop. So, there's no reason why I should develop.
Yes, I understand.
But you have to find ways to make music move or move on, and so I tend. It's back to the songlines idea. It's looking at a line of song in a different way, and that's what I keep trying to renew. A line of song, really.
Yesterday, you also made some remarks about looking towards the future and mankind, and how your music relates to that. Music from the 90s.
Yes, I think because in the 90s, clearly, because I've been influenced by the Northern Territory and what is today a fairly pristine world, a paradise, and of course I worry about the future of that, the environment. But my present concern is really with global population, because the thought that by the middle of this century the world's population might have doubled itself. Well, the way it's going, it will have doubled itself. I have no idea. I mean, I'm convinced that science will solve the problems with food, with energy, global warming. Well, I hope that one can be solved, and other problems. But my real concern is with the compounding or the doubling of human hatred. There is so much hatred on this planet today, and if it doubles, I mean, what kind of world will it be? And so, therefore, for the rest of my life, I plan to write music that is uplifting, that gives out joy, goodness, the good news, because that too can compound itself.
Yes.
And in that way, I can maybe help battle the darker forces.
Well, I know we've had many enthusiastic comments. We've played Dreamtracks a lot, and also the other two works you gave us, the Lange
and the Night Song. Yes.
And the Night Song, they're very beautiful.
But I was so inspired by your performance in Washington
thank you.
that's why I had to get up and talk about the future and my future music, because I suddenly felt that in your performance you really did make us all feel uplifted, and I thought, I've succeeded in the piece.
Well, I mean,
give out this feeling.
We always search for what the composer might have in mind, or what can be contained, and you can't. The interesting thing is you can't really put something there that isn't there. But
no, well, that's true.
Because we try to find the hidden meaning or the inside meaning of every piece.
That's right.
And sometimes it takes a while to develop a feeling for it, And with your work, we've been playing that for quite a few years now.
Yes.
And so we really do feel that it, you know, it just rises up at the end, and it's very exciting. And
yeah, and I take your point about you can play louder than a string quartet, because I mean that is really what struck me last night.
Well, with the power of the piano and the piano clarinet,
and I know, and the music was welling up and welling up, and suddenly it was feeling so joyous and so good. I thought,
great.
yes, music, we can combat all that hatred.
Thank you so much, Peter, for coming to our concerts here, for speaking to us for the camera, and most of all for the beautiful works you've written for us. And I do hope you'll consider writing another work for us.
Well, thank you, Walter. You may well get that new piece too.
I hope so. I hope so.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Recently, somebody found for me a huge portrait of me. It was huge, bigger than this screen, and everybody said, "Oh, you must put it above the desk." Well, the thought of having a portrait of myself in front of me when I work was just not on, and I certainly wouldn't replace this screen with anything else because I just love it dearly. I actually bought it in Sydney. Some of the other screens I bought in Japan, but this I found in Sydney, and it thrills me.
It's a beautiful piece.
It is a nice one. It was painted in 1750, and the gilding is still very good, whereas some recent ones that I've bought, the gilding is already going a little bit, actually. That's for sacred water. Balinese. I'm rather fond of it. Hot holy water.
Oh, really?
So, but there's not much room on. My desk actually was made, I had it made when I lived in a smaller house, and it's I could do with a bigger desk. I keep meaning to do something about that.
You do composing here as well, or?
I do my composing between the desk and my piano.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but most of my writing and ruling up, everything gets done here, really.
On your desk.
Yeah. But I do like writing music at the piano. Because, you know, some composers say, "Oh, I never write music at the piano," but I like the sound. I like to, you know, the sound begets sound, and I like to hear it in the air, and it seems to stimulate me, actually. that's a little piano piece that I've just written for an Indonesian pianist who's traveling around the world collecting piano pieces from composers as a memorial for the Balinese bombing. So, and for once in my life, it's a piece that's not influenced by Indonesian music. It's just a piece that I wrote, really. So, I haven't played it as slowly as that before. I'm beginning to wonder if I've got the wrong metronome mark on it. Maybe it should be slow, like as I played it. Mm-hmm. Metronome markings are always such a problem, aren't they? Oh, yeah. So therefore, I suppose I've been writing for 60-odd years, because I began when I was about 7. I had art lessons, and so I was taught to draw, and then it was decided I should have music lessons. So I went to my first music lesson and assumed that I was learning to write music. It had never occurred to me that it was to learn to play an instrument. I thought it was similar to learning art. You draw and learn music, you write music. So I wrote music all the week, went back to my teacher, who was so furious with me, she caned me across the knuckles, so I couldn't play the piano anyway. And she said it was bad to write music, and all the composers are dead anyway. So I wrote it under the bedclothes with a torch for a year. And my parents discovered me eventually, and they said, "That's all right, you don't have to resort to doing that." But they didn't treat it as something unusual, which was very good. They just sort of let it happen, yes, which was wonderful. So, and that was, I've been writing music ever since. It was when I went to England, actually, in the late 50s, that I thought that my peers would think the same as I did. I was looking forward to talking with. I became very friendly with Peter Maxwell Davies, who's now Master of the Queen's Music. And I just assumed Max would be interested in Japanese music, Indonesian music, Australian indigenous music, but he had no interest at all. And my tutor at Oxford had just edited the new Oxford history of primitive and oriental music. You couldn't use primitive today, of course. Yeah. And in it, there's no mention of Australian Aboriginal music. And I said, but, this is one of the oldest musics in the world. And he said, oh, but it's not important. And that was very important to me, because I realized that, all right, it was of no importance to him in Western Europe, but to me as an Australian, it was important and is important, and therefore I should look to my own world for my music and not to the Western world.
Well, yeah, that certainly makes sense. Just along those lines, Bartók started with his great interest in ethnic music,
yes,
and of course was very influenced by that. And what do you make of his?
Well, Bartók was
endeavors.
He was a very important influence on me at one stage. I liked his music, still do, but he was like a role model in a way. He gave me like the courage to continue. After I finished studying at the University of Melbourne and went back to Tasmania, I couldn't earn much of a living in Tasmania through music. And my brother was getting to a point where he was going to open a sports shop, mostly shooting and fishing. And so I went into partnership with him, and I was in business with him for about 6 years. And I enjoyed that.
In Launceston?
In Launceston, Tasmania.
Launceston,
yeah.
yes.
Mm.
Yes.
Because the family's always been into fishing and shooting and things like that in Tasmania.
And you as well?
And,
Sorry?
and do you enjoy, I think Elsa said, do you enjoy the fishing and hunting as well?
Well, do I enjoy fishing? I used to enjoy fishing. I was not so fond of shooting. I think because I didn't greatly care for shooting animals. And also my brother and both my parents were expert shots. So I decided to take up the bow and arrow. So I became pretty good with a bow and arrow, actually. But I did enjoy, I do enjoy guns, and particularly antique weapons. And I think that's something that I inherited from my father and also got from my brother, who has a wonderful collection of weapons, including some ones owned by Wild Bill Hickok. After I left the sport shop, I left it because we decided it was time that I should get back to music, and I went first of all to Canberra and then to Sydney writing light music for the theatre. And I lived in Sydney writing for reviews for the Phillip Street Theatre. That was in the mid-50s. And then by stroke of good luck, I was given a scholarship from the University of Melbourne to go abroad to study, to do whatever I wanted to do. And so I thought, well, I'll go to Oxford and get a doctorate, because my father never did understand my music or what I was doing, but he always supported me, certainly emotionally and morally, and a little bit financially, but my parents couldn't afford to help very much. And so I went to Oxford. My doctorate was well on the way. And then my father got cancer. And so I came home to Tasmania. My father died. And everyone said I should go back to Oxford. But apart from the fact that I couldn't afford it, and in those days, this is early 60s, it was a long way. And in any case, I didn't want the doctorate anymore, because I didn't want it for me. It was only for my father. So I stayed home, and I wrote a piece called Un Canne de Four for solo violin, strings, and percussion in his memory. And I'm glad I did stay home and write it, because it's a work that endures. And in fact, there's a press in England bringing out a series of books on landmarks in music of the 20th century, and a woman has been commissioned to write a book solely on Un Canne de Four.
Really?
So that's
wonderful.
Yes. So that wouldn't have happened if I'd gone back to Oxford, probably, and not written the piece.
Absolutely.
After that, Oxford, and then back to Tasmania, and then after applying for a few jobs without luck, I ended up at the University of Sydney teaching, and I taught there until the late, from 1963 until the late 90s. During the course of that time, I lived in the States for several years, and in England for several years on extended leave, but I was based in Sydney, really. My favourite city in the world.
Yes.
So,
one of ours also.
But I'm biased. So.
And just one last question, and you did a beautiful drawing for the Dreamtracks. Right. Is that something that you do often, or?
Well, unfortunately I don't have much time to draw, but I've always consoled myself that if I dried up musically, I could take up drawing and painting. So. Along with lots of other things. Yes. But I don't think I'm going to dry up. Well, I grew up in Tasmania, and inevitably it was the Tasmanian landscape that influenced me. Also, the fate of our indigenous people. I developed a great concern about that. And in fact, because we managed to kill the full-blooded Aborigines off, in the 19th century, I was very worried that we might lose the language. And as a schoolboy, I started to compile a dictionary in the best way of Tasmanian English. I later discovered that somebody else had done it, but it was just in manuscript in a library. I've still got the dictionary, actually.
Really? And was this English with Aboriginal influences?
It was Tasmanian Aboriginal words with English translation.
Actually. I see.
So
I see.
I just went through all the old books I could find to get the words, and then put them in alphabetical order. So it was very incomplete, but it was quite substantial all the same.
And did that have any kind of influence as far as your music is concerned, the sounds or the rhythms of the language?
Yes, well, I became very interested in Australian indigenous culture, and what little I could find of Tasmanian music wasn't very interesting. I mean, it tended to be very monotonous, almost. But then I later directed my attention to Australian Aboriginal music, and I found that much more interesting, and certainly I've used it, particularly in recent years, in my work.
Have you actually quoted from Australian Aboriginal music, or just sort of been influenced like Bartok was with some
influenced, really, yes. There is one melody that I have used fairly consistently that is in Dreamtracks, and that's the Jalili melody. What is interesting is that your former student, Nick Milton, doing a PhD thesis at Columbia University on my string quartets, and he discovered the Jalili melody in my string quartet number 4, written in 1950. That was before any white person had heard Jalili. And it's note for note, beginning on the same pitch as the indigenous melody. When, in 1974, I was looking for an Aboriginal melody, and I listened to the old Professor Elkin recordings of music in Arnhem Land. And the moment I heard the melody, that was it. That was the one I had to use. And I hadn't realized that I'd written it by coincidence, but it must have been something about that sequence of notes that attracted me. And so because of that, I've used the Aboriginal melody a great deal, because obviously it has a meaning for me.
Yes. Do you mind just playing it on the piano? Or?
Right. Is that quite easy to do? Right. It goes. It's almost silent. Mine begins down there. It's a bit. It's a bit rhythmically a little bit different, and the Aboriginal one.
Yes, thank
and
you.
mine has the same sequence of notes, but
Yeah.
a slightly different rhythm,
Yes,
actually.
yeah.
So
And then, of course, the setting and how you use it. Is
that's right.
Very,
Yes.
very, very interesting.
So I mean, Aboriginal music, for a time, Asian music was very important to me, but slowly Australian indigenous music took over, really.
Yeah, and how about, you said Asian music was very important to you. How did you get into Asian music? Did you?
Well, I think that too goes back to my youth or childhood, actually, because friends of my uncle went to Japan once a year on business trips, and they'd bring back presents for all the children. And I used to have presents, Japanese objects, from the time that I was really quite young. So I developed an interest in Japan and an interest also in collecting Buddhas. So it was inevitable that I should look to Japanese music.
And how about the Indonesian music, the gamelan? Were you interested in that?
Excuse me, sorry. Gamelan music, I was always very interested in it, but it was hard to find out about it. And when I was composer in residence at Yale in 1966, a wonderful book by Colin McPhee came out, Canadian composer, called Music in Bali, and it was very detailed, perhaps the greatest book ever written on music outside the Western world. And through learning about it, through reading about it, I was able to be influenced by it. Japanese music was more readily available on recording, Japanese music and Balinese were the most influential, really. Japanese court music, gagaku, which is perhaps my favorite of all the music of mankind, has its roots in Shintoism, and it's still played today in Shinto ceremonies. And that has been very influential upon my own music, the court music.
The court music. Is it instrumental music? I'm not familiar with
it. It began as a vocal music with instruments, and today it's instrumental. Yes, like a large chamber group consisting of strings, stringed instruments, wind instruments, and percussion.
You mentioned that you always enjoyed working with the performers, and that to some extent you were influenced in your writing by the people you worked with.
Almost all my music has been written for friends, because I suppose for me writing music is about the heart, and if you have a good friend, it's hard enough writing music, and therefore, if your heart is really in it and you're writing for a dear friend, then it's going to make it easier, really. And it's also because you get to know a friend's instrument, and you're writing for that instrument. I mean, I have a beautiful story about this. When I was at Yale, I wrote quite a bit of music for string quartet. And, what was his name? Aldo Pariso was the cellist in the quartet. And his quartet, this was in the mid-60s, his instrument was left to him by Feuermann, and it's the Stradivarius, the Monk, very famous Strad cello. And so I wrote very much for that, and we even invented new sounds on the instrument, like running fingers up the back to make bird sounds, which some people objected to because they said it was bad for the varnish. Didn't worry Aldo. Anyway, that was that. I loved that cello. Then, many years later, that was mid-60s, in the late 80s, I wrote a cello concerto for first performance by Stephen Isserlis in England. And then I discovered that Aldo had sold the cello to the Japanese government. Stephen had written to the government to ask if he could borrow the cello and had it on unlimited loan. And so I was in England and I heard my cello concerto. The first performance was on this cello, this very cello that I knew so well.
Oh, wonderful.
And I was very touched by that. It added an extraordinary dimension to me in listening to the work.
Is there any consistency in the way you start to compose something? I mean, once you've decided to write for somebody and on the type of piece it is and so forth, I mean, can you pin down or give us some insight into?
I usually begin from the outside. Like I might even draw a series of boxes, and I may not necessarily begin with the musical idea, but more
form,
more like planning a building almost, because I start with the structure, and then some music comes to me when I know what the piece is about, and I might put that in box, say C. The boxes I might number A1, B1, A2, C, B2, and so on.
Yes.
And then I'd have arrows joining them where the music is going to relate. It is like planning a building in a way, planning a structure. And I don't necessarily begin at the beginning. I put somehow the idea that comes to me seems to belong in a certain part of the structure that I'm planning. And then slowly I fill up all the boxes, and when that's done, the work is more or less complete. So it's beginning from the outside, working in, really. What is really interesting is I found over years of teaching that women who write music tend, on the whole, to begin at the beginning, and the music grows and flowers. And of course, that makes absolute sense, really, when you think about it. In fact, I suspect that there are, musical structure was invented by men. I suspect that there are wonderful forms out there in the air somewhere that are women's structures, and I would love to think that they might be pulled out of the air one day and let the music sound.
But you think there's some consistency there, that women tend to write from beginning to end, and
on the whole,
men
yes.
More. William Schumann at
Yes.
Juilliard said that when somebody asked him about how he goes about composing, he said, "Well, I get up at 5 in the morning and I work from 6 till 10, every morning."
Right.
But do you subscribe to any kind of regular hours?
No.
Or
that's very interesting because I lived at Yaddo, the artist colony in Upper New York State some years ago, and I found that the writers would get up, not always so early, but they'd type or write till coffee time in the morning or till lunchtime, and then spend the rest of the day enjoying themselves. Painters, at that time action painting was in, and there was one painter who would put paint on a bike wheel and spin it round against a canvas and splatter it everywhere, and his day's work would be over before breakfast. Composers, we were there to work hard, so we would tend to work all day, and then at night, when everyone went off to play pool or ice skate, we'd go back to our cabins and copy out neatly what we'd written during the day. So, unfortunately, composition does take more physical time than any other art form. Well, I seem to have written in most musical forms, piano music, solo instrumental music, chamber music, especially string quartets, orchestral music, in particular music for string orchestra, because I like homogeneous sounds rather than heterogeneous sounds, and therefore that's why I love the string quartet, because I think it's one of the, along with the grand Georgian house, I think that the string quartet is one of the great achievements of the Western world, really. And I've written opera, what could be called oratorio, and when one by the time one reaches 75, there's a sort of fair body of work there. What is extraordinary is that up till 1993, when Deborah Hayes published her biobibliography on me in the States, I'd written 224 works, and from 1993 to the present, I've written 330, I think so. So I've written over 100 works in just over 10 years, which is extraordinary. I didn't discover that till recently. I think it's partly because I retired from teaching at the university, and partly, very definitely, the advent of Sibelius 7, the software program for processing music.
But you don't use it yourself?
I don't use it myself, no. I'm a rather obsessive person, and I think if I used it myself, I'd probably spend more time on the way it looked than on the way it sounded. And I don't want to become particularly computer literate. I'd rather write music as I always have, with pencil and paper.
Well, you have a beautiful manuscript, and that's I enjoy seeing your scores and also your handwriting.
Yeah.
And I think that's the one regrettable thing about the computer age.
Yes.
You don't see a composer's handwriting anymore.
No. Well, I much prefer my handwritten scores to the computer print outs, but on the other hand, one doesn't spend one's life looking at one's scores.
You've just finished a major work, the Requiem, that was premiered at Adelaide.
That's right.
Richard Mills conducting, right?
With Richard.
With
That's
Richard
right.
conducting.
Yes.
And what are your plans now? Aside from our duo, we were talked about
the duo for you.
For Elsa and
yes.
myself.
Well, I'm up to Shostakovich with string quartet, so I've written 15, and that needs a bit of revision. Then I've been commissioned to write the 16th and 17th. So with the 16th, I'll be up to Dvorak, and then the 18th, I'll be up to Beethoven. So I might leave it at that. We'll see. But they'll be written in the next within the year.
And is it for the same group for the?
No, the 16th quartet is being commissioned by Musica Viva here in Australia, and it was originally going to be for the Kronos quartet, and I said to David Harrington, the leader, what shall I write, and what sort of quartet, and he said, loud and wild. So then it turned out that it's being given its first performance by the Tokyo String Quartet. But I'll still make it loud and wild, I think. Yeah. Not all loud and wild, but yes. And the 17th, I might even base on a melody of Beethoven. Just, I think it'd be a nice thing to do, really.
Certainly. Well, we look very much forward to your duo, and maybe eventually we can even persuade you to write another trio for our trio too.
I haven't got a clue about the duo for you and Elsa, but when the idea comes, then I'll be writing non-stop.
Can you tell your experience with the Buddhist monks? You stayed in a monastery, didn't you?
Well, I've, I mentioned earlier that I collected Buddhas, and then in the 60s, when we were full of psychedelia and flower power and so on, we all said we were Zen Buddhists without knowing anything about it. If anyone said, "What are you?" I'd say, "I'm a Zen Buddhist." And I was once in Japan in the late 60s, and I thought, well, I'd better find out about Zen Buddhism. So I went to stay in a monastery, and I soon became a non-Buddhist, Zen Buddhist.
But you stayed there for quite a while.
I stayed there for a month or 6 weeks.
6 weeks, yeah.
And for instance, well, we slept on the floor with a wooden pillow, and our food was a regimen of rice with a few vegetables just about for every meal. And I'd go to the garden, and my Zen master would ask me a question or certain questions. He did speak a little German. My German isn't especially good, and my Japanese almost non-existent, and he spoke no English. So it was a little hard, but somehow we communicated. And I might get a question wrong, and that was fine. And then the next question I might get right, and then I'd be beaten, thwacked on the back. And then the next question I might get wrong, and I wouldn't be beaten. And the whole idea was to drive logic from my mind in order that one can reach up to, some kind of enlightenment and transcend.
That transcends logic, or
yes, that's right.
I see.
And I think if I'd stayed much longer, I would have gone mad. Actually, not reached enlightenment. But what was really beautiful was that through a friend, I met a Shinto abbot. The two religions of Japan are Buddhism and Shintoism. And I'd visit him quite often. And the difference was extraordinary. When I'd go to the Shinto shrine, the abbot's wife and daughter would rush out to meet me, and it was all smiles, and we'd sit on the floor and have green tea. Whereas the wives and children of the Buddhist monks I didn't ever meet because they lived in a complex next door. There was a waterfall at the Shinto shrines, a beautiful, slender waterfall like something out of Hokusai print. Whereas at the Zen place, there was a very famous waterfall with no water. It was all rocks, and people used to come and gasp and take photos. But when I'd look at it, I would just see rocks. I preferred the waterfall as nature intended. And similarly, the gardens at the Shinto shrine grew naturally, whereas if you look carefully at the Zen temple, at the gardens, you would see everything was, held, pulled back and twisted with wire and control.
I see.
And it was because I've always had a deep love of nature. If I have a religion, it's a kind of pantheism. And so I became very drawn to Shintoism because it's concerned with nature and concerned with the sacred in all things. I don't think a Westerner could adopt Shintoism really, but it's the one religion that I do place over all others. And certainly I would never ever say again that I'm a Zen Buddhist. when I was at Yellow, there was a very nice man, large Italian with lots of kids in New York. He was very, very poor. So poor that if ever we'd go into Saratoga Springs for a drink, when it was his turn to pay the round, I'd quietly pay for it, because he really couldn't afford it. And he was writing a book that he hoped would sell to the movies, and he'd read bits to me, every few days, and sounded rather good. Anyway, his name was Mario Puzo.
Oh my God!
And he was writing The Godfather.
Really?
So he owes me a few drinks. I think he can afford it now.
My goodness! Wow.
They were good days. But with me in writing music, I don't write every day. I have to wait for the right idea to come, and then when it does come, I just go at it all the time, day and night, non-stop, really.
Well, with some of our composers, Giancarlo Minati also said that he just has to wait for the right idea to come, otherwise he
absolutely.
can't. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So
no. I mean, there have been periods when I've tried to write every day, but it means that a lot gets thrown away.
Yes.
But when the right idea comes, and you just work away at it, really.
Was it last year you received the award, were inducted into the American Academy?
That was...
Oh, it was 2 years ago?
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
That's right. Yes, I was very honoured by that, because as far as I know, I'm the only living Australian to be a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Christina Stead, the writer, and Sidney Nolan, the painter, Alec Hope, the poet, were inducted, but they're dead now, actually.
Yes.
So I felt very touched by that. Somebody loves me somewhere.
No, and then can you tell us a little about the ceremony? We saw you briefly before you went there, and then I think,
That's
did you
right,
say
yes.
Ned Rorem spoke?
Yes, Ned was there and he spoke, and in fact it was Ned who did the inducting. In fact, it was lovely to see Ned again.
Yes.
And there were other American composers there and writers, and it was just a beautiful occasion. It was special because the big dinner where they were inducting people was to take place a few months later. But it so happened they were having a dinner at that time, and so I had my own induction, which was very good. And then afterwards, a few of us went with Yevgeny Yevtushenko, the poet, to a Russian nightclub, and I left my glasses there. And I thought, oh, what am I going to do? And so next morning, I went out and bought some off the rack in a drugstore, and they're better than my prescription glasses.
Yes, awesome.
So I've now got lots of them all around the house. Talking of gagaku, Japanese court music, I had heard quite a bit of it on long playing record, but I'd never heard it live. And so I was in Japan at a conference in the late 60s, and I said to a composer, Matsudaira, would it be possible for me to hear gagaku while I'm here? And he said, I phone relation, tell you tomorrow. So I saw him the next day, and he said he'd phone relation, and if I met him at the Tokyo railway station a week later, he'd take me to hear gagaku. I was staying in Kyoto, and the day came to go to Tokyo. It was it was unbelievably hot. I mean, the humidity was appalling. So I caught the train in some old shorts and, generally maybe just old clothes, and then arrived at the Tokyo railway station. And then suddenly a 3-seat, tiered black Mercedes pulled up in front of me, and there was Matsudaira and his mistress, and I got in and we drove to hear the Gogoku, and then I suddenly realized, my God, we're driving into the Imperial Palace. And we pulled up at the front, and Matsudaira said, now we meet Relation. And Relation was the Empress of Japan.
Oh, my goodness.
Who was a charming woman, but I felt so stupid in my shorts and old clothes and so on and so on. It was a bit embarrassing for me. But anyway, she took us and the grandchildren to a shrine in the grounds where they had the imperial court had its Gogoku ensemble, and I heard my first Japanese court music there with the Empress of Japan. It was special, really.
Fascinating.
So,
well, thank you. And was it all you expected?
it was more than I expected.
Yeah.
It was in real life, this extraordinary twanging and thudding and the bending of pitches and so on. But you know, it's not surprising that I was drawn to Asian music because my father had a general store in the country, and he'd go to a Chinese market garden to buy vegetables, and sometimes he'd take me when I was a little boy, and when they knew I liked music, they used to get out instruments and play a little open-air concert.
Yeah.
And I found it just so exciting, that music. And then when I went to my first orchestral concert in the local National Theatre, I found it rather pallid by comparison to the Chinese music as a little boy. So it's not surprising that I should have looked to Asia, really.